Howdy, all you delicious people. Spawn. This movie, to me, ultimately there were some slight hesitations really reviewing this movie because I know that Michael J. White had not liked the finished product of this film. Ultimately, the man who himself had played Al Simmons' Spawn, who ultimately know had recently been done, or had done the movie Welcome to Sudden Death. So, when going into this, Michael J. White had mentioned that he did not like how many several effects there were doing this. Like, he was really just interested in the actual story of the film, but everything got so muddled up, and there was too many cooks in the kitchen, meaning there was too many smaller things taken up with Spawn going after the fight of wanting Wanda back, the fight of also wanting to go after Jason Wynn, and also he also wanted to go after the clown as well. There's too many cooks in the kitchen during this movie. There's too many like there's too many things simultaneously going on that they didn't focus too much in any one of them. They basically all they wanted to do was how many more effects can we fit into this film. And so I think that's the only bad part about this movie is this movie suffered without story because there was too many intermittent or just there was not enough focus on the story. So going into this, we have a villain called the Clown or the Violator. So when watching the HBO Spawn series, which ultimately had Keith David in it, which is wonderful, we have this series being every episode being introduced by Todd McFarlane, and ultimately to me I loved the Spawn series up until the very last episode. I think the very last episode gets a little bit too dark. It gets a little bit too wow, okay, all right, so we're doing this, all right. From my memory, from my recollection, more than likely, maybe the show is darker than I remember, but I did really like the series. I overall liked the heartbroken notion of some of these episodes. So, Spawn. Going into here, we have John Leguizamo as the Clown. And reasonably, I think this movie kicked off for me wanting to eventually get to know John Leguizamo through other stuff. Every single time I would ever see John Leguizamo in anything, I'm like, I need to see more of this man somehow. Ultimately, leading me to watch movies like the Pest or Mario Brothers, the movie. Seeing The Happening that John Leguizamo was in, and so on and so forth. This movie kicked off for me wanting to see more this guy was in. Because, man, that guy being in his suit like that was, I was like, wow, I am impressed. Did they add him in CG, or did they ultimately, make him kneel down at some points? How do they approach all of this? How do they do it? I'm fascinated. So we have Martin Sheen playing a guy that you would normally see Martin Sheen play. A very a very commanding or very threatening-ish person, but I think the later on that Martin Sheen you would see him do softer roles. Like you would see him be an Amazing Spider-Man as Ben Parker and stuff like that. So a lot of the times you would see Martin Sheen doing these more like vicious roles, but then eventually the later on he would start to change the career choices that he did, which I thought was like, that's great, that's awesome. Ultimately, Martin Sheen at some point was in the video games Mass Effect. Throwing that out there. So let's ultimately mention Spawn really in this film has a slow build. Basically, like from head to toe, he is burnt. His entire body is burnt. Eventually, being seemingly in some cocoon of a growing up, like maturity that his eventual spawn body needs to go through, which ultimately John Leguizamo makes fun of, and then eventually when Al Simmons really makes the realization that he actually is dead, that is the real pushing factor for him to eventually become Spawn by seeing seemingly his own dead body. So, regardless of some very interesting visuals, there is a goofy moment where eventually you have to have a seemingly large dog-ish like character summoning the clown to Earth to eventually get Spawn, which ultimately when that scene arrives, I'm like, man, this is such a goofy looking visual, and I would have liked to have seen eventually, like, when they remake this movie, which I hear that Jamie Foxx is quasi tied to, but who knows when that'll actually come out. It'll be interesting to see how they improve things or how they change things or what they do for this seemingly remake. We are now seeing Al Simmons within this movie kind of being a nomad, or there's no place for him to go. And so recently he ends up just like sticking with bums, sticking with men on the street, and because ultimately he can't just go back home and them know who he is. So ultimately because he tries to, but he can't fit back in with a family that doesn't know who he is, so he is pushed to live on the street and ultimately find out within himself that all he has left, because he doesn't have Wanda, is revenge. So that is, I think, a point of where we can leave off at, and that is a point where we can get into spoilers. So let's go and talk about some of this stuff. If anything, visually interesting, but at the end of the day, that's all that probably you'd have to say about this film. Visually impressive. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of this film, Al Simmons takes out some foreign forces coming off of a plane. So it seems like Al Simmons' character is working on a business with Terry, which is his best friend, contracted to take out these foreign forces, or whoever he thinks is a villain of this country. Ultimately, while Al takes out people without really asking questions, eventually, when Al and Terry are going to work together, it seems that Al is starting to ask questions about, like, man, who are all the people that we're really taking out? Like, it just seems like we're getting orders from somebody, and like how many people are we going to just kill? And Terry's just like, well, hey man, like that's us. We've always been people that just took orders. It's like Semper Fi, and like letting us know that um, that Terry and Al had both been in the Marines together, and so reasonably they are just people just taking orders. But Al is kind of growing a conscience, or just like going like, why are we doing what we're doing? I'm confused. So so we have it to where Al is starting to ask questions, and we have Martin Sheen, who I believe is, like, to me, I would believe that Jason Wynn is probably the boss over Terry and Al, who are giving them orders to kill everyone, I would assume, because matching outfits at some point. Um, we ultimately have Jessica Wynn, or Jason Wynn, and Jessica Priest, who ultimately is Jason Wynn's second in command. So we have the clown, or the violator, going to Jason, or going to Wynn and mentioning like, hey, like I want Al Simmons, and I want him to be, I want him dead, because ultimately I'm like, he's asking questions, and ultimately he's growing a conscience, and like I want to take him out before um, he starts uh, like changing or adjusting his path, because right now Al is at a crossroads, or going to be at a crossroads soon, and starting to ask about things. So Al eventually is called to take down this environment that is supposedly going to be spreading some virus. So eventually he goes and starts lacing all these explosives, and Jason Wynn and Jessica Priest intercepts him, and ultimately we have it to where uh, Jason Wynn shows up, and ultimately Jessica Priest uh, shoots him to take him down, and then ultimately has some kind of, I would probably say, like, to me it may be like antifreeze or something like that, that they put on him, like it's some kind of like green goopy substance, which I'm like, okay, why is it that these guns not only fire all these bullets, but then right after that they lace him with all this, like, this green chemical, which I'm like, that, like, what did they switch out guns, and they had guns that did two different things? That made no sense. But anyways, so ultimately we have Jason Wynn that just wants to unleash a virus and kill a bunch of people, and ultimately Al is asking questions, so reasonably it's time to kill him off. So reasonably what ends up happening is they toss the light onto Al Simmons, have the entire place explode, and then Jason Wynn and Jessica Priest get out unscathed. So reasonably, within this movie, of course, we have Al Simmons seemingly in going through to be sent to hell seemingly for 5 years, because reasonably, I guess time in hell and time on earth are two different things. Like, we have Al Simmons that is just falling into hell for seemingly 5 years. So when Al eventually comes back to Earth after being pushed back, the demon that summons the clown to say, hey, like, make sure that he, like, becomes Spawn, make sure you push him, make sure you uh, make him think that all he has left to do is just work for us. So we have it to where Al eventually plops back onto Earth and eventually is having a lot of problems, like being able to move again, being able to do anything again. And basically, his skin is basically telling him that, like, his skin feels like it's going to explode. Eventually, we repetitiously have John Leguizamo as a clown coming to Spawn and trying to lay down the land of everything. Like, basically, the Violator is telling Spawn, or the clown is telling Spawn that it's like, hey, I like this is a world that has completely forgotten about you. It's been 5 years since you've been here. Like, but hey, if you want to try to get back with Wanda, go ahead. So recently, eventually, Al goes and tries to seek Wanda back out, and eventually he is not strong enough to really see her. Eventually he collapses when trying to see her. The clown eventually is at Wanda's daughter's birthday party because ultimately she had gotten remarried with Terry, and so now they are at this birthday party, and John Leguizamo is doing all these seemingly goofy looking magic tricks, and ultimately he mentions, like, yeah, I know a lot of these tricks are ancient, but they're snot, because ultimately he blows his nose and sneeze onto the or blows his nose onto the to his handkerchief. So ultimately we have Al Simmons dragging his way to get to this house, to meet Wanda's daughter, and ultimately Wanda's daughter is going to give Spawn candy, and Spawn is just like reaching for it, and Wanda notices that her daughter is talking to some bum, and so ultimately Terry gets out to be like, hey, who are you? What are you doing here? And so the clown comes in and evades everything. It's like, oh no, he works for me. Oh no, like don't beat him up. Don't like, just let him be. It's, if anything, he's just kind of going through some stuff, and he'll be okay. So pushing us on to eventually, because the clown eventually drags him out of this party. So eventually, here's where Al Simmons mentions that his skin is feeling like it's gonna explode, and John and the clown mentions it's like, well, like, your body is experiencing changes. You're eventually going to hit puberty, and so there your body's gonna start to grow hair and in places that you wouldn't have thought of it. And like ultimately he keeps grabbing onto him and touching him, and so reasonably the clown is going to push Spawn to dig up his own grave, and so Spawn does, and eventually he sees his own marine hat, and ultimately his own body grabs onto him and tries to push him back into the grave. All the while, we have some seemingly young kids that are trying to summon the devil or trying to channel something off to the side, but justifiably they eventually come walking down to this gravesite, ultimately asking, "Hey, did the devil send you?" And the clown says back, "It's like, man, like, why is it that, why is it that heaven gets all the good ones and we get all the retards?" So we ultimately have it at this point in time where Spawn eventually gets so angry that eventually he turns into the costume of Spawn. And so recently for the rest of the movie, like, instead of wearing any normal street clothes or whatever, basically Spawn is wearing the suit of Spawn the rest of this film. So we will have it to where Spawn is going and is wanting to seek on revenge, wanting to seek his revenge on Jason Wynn. So recently what Spawn does what he only knows how to do, is get a bunch of guns, find a bunch of guns somewhere, and go after Jason Wynn at seemingly this restaurant or seemingly this fine dining get together. So we have it to where Al Simmons shows up, starts firing away at everybody, and then ultimately wants Jason Wynn dead. So Jessica Priest is loaded up with her weaponry, and ultimately is going to try to fight Spawn, but Jason is basically telling Jessica Priest, "Hey, go and kill him good." And we find out that when Spawn ends up getting fired upon, that all the bullets heal, so reasonably having him be shot several times with guns isn't going to matter. So eventually Spawn goes and sees Jessica Priest, ends up disarming her, and eventually we have it to where Spawn eventually chucks Jessica Priest onto a table, and the table, of course, breaks in half. So, reasonably, we have it to where Spawn is still trying to get to Jason, but ultimately we're having more and more people come in to prevent Spawn from doing this, to where Spawn eventually, instead of repetitiously trying to fight this out, eventually he just escapes, ultimately to be met outside of said building with a swarm of policemen. To ultimately he has to either Spider-Man crawl up a wall, or he has to ultimately stealth camouflage himself, blending into some building. But the only problem is that he fits in the building to where they couldn't see him, but when he phases out, he ultimately knocks down some part of some building to where they see him again, to where he just consistently ends up just running around and then flying off to evade things. We ultimately have a Calastro who is played by Nicole Williamson, who is also kind of a a Spawn-esque like character, but he is trying to do good. He was a person that was probably the very first person to come back and kill people, but he decided not to, so they ended up sending Spawn instead, which I would have to naturally assume. So we have Calastro, who goes into here and he comes in here with a sword off of his arm, and he's wearing chainmail and medieval times esque like things and stuff like that. Almost kind of the caretaker to Spawn's Ghost Rider in a sense. Basically telling Spawn, hey, don't use these guns anymore. This is stupid that you're using guns won't work. Like, you have to figure out how to use your Spawn like abilities. You have to be able to concentrate, and whatever you're concentrating on, your Spawn like armor will help you figure things out, or be able to do whatever you want it to do. To where we consistently have this like the little like skull things that are on the sides of uh, Spawn's chest eventually like jump out and try to break a bottle. Ultimately, there is a point in time where Spawn's like belt buckle, like a skull, eventually pops out and tries to brace a kick to the nuts, and eventually it gets to the point to where more and more we have Spawn who eventually will use things with his power to his benefit, and there are some interesting things going on within these abilities. So, going on to here, we have Spawn eventually living the life of a hobo, and eventually he is with this other person learning things, and the clown isn't liking that. He isn't liking that. It seems that Al Simmons is much more getting swayed, and otherwise, we have Jason Wynn, who is going into surgery to put a thing within connected to his heart that is going to unleash a virus if he were to die. So he's kind of being Iron Man into, he's being like Iron Man'd out to take this this crazy surgery that if Martin Sheen's character was to die, that ultimately he would release this virus. So, and Al Simmons has to be pushed to kill Jason Wynn, which the clown was trying very much so to do, but ultimately there was some things swaying Spawn to do so, because reasonably it's just like, well, like, how about you like train yourself? How about you don't go in guns blazing and like learn a thing or two and have friendship again in this second time around, and trust some people and this and that. So, like, learn to let things go. Some stuff like basically tying yourself onto Wanda, you can't do that now. So ultimately, like, clear your head a little bit and like be the hero that we need you to be, because there's so very few. So now we have it to where the clown is getting a little ticked off, so reasonably we are having Spawn going and trying to take out the clown very much by going on a motorcycle that eventually gets spawned out to go after the clown and try to, via some interesting battle sequences, or mostly just CGI sequences. Ultimately, at first, the motorcycle that Spawn was on gets all spawned out, but then eventually he turns into some kind of wedging device that ultimately catapults the clown's car into destroying itself, to where the clown eventually, his vehicle explodes, the clown is way up in the air, and ultimately it's like, well, the fight between Spawn and the clown is just going to be an unstoppable force and an immovable object, so it's really just like, well, Spawn is wasting his time going after the clown, but the clown eventually will go after Wanda. Because eventually the clown turns into the Violator, which is this big, gigantic, monster, and tries to attack not only some homeless people, but then eventually goes after Spawn. Spawn tries to use some techniques that he has learned to try to evade or avoid this big, giant monster. But again, basically immovable force, unstoppable object, and so reasonably the Violator kidnaps Wanda and Terry and eventually has them at their home. Martin Sheen eventually is also there to hope that they can intercept Al and eventually have Al kill Jason, which won't happen. So Al eventually is pushed to try to save Wanda, and when he eventually goes to their house, he goes in there and Jason Wynn is there. We're ultimately told that, hey, you can't kill Jason Wynn because he has a device within his heart that ultimately will release a virus and kill Wanda's daughter and kill Terry and everyone that he loves. So what is Spawn going to do? Is he going to work for the clown's boss and do whatever he says, or is he going to kill Jason and let everyone that he loves dies? What is he going to do? So we get to the point of Spawn eventually taking down Jason, but not to the point of death, to where eventually Spawn can X-ray through Jason's body and take out this virus-like thing and pull it out of his body and destroy it. And so Wanda is supposedly all tied up, and reasonably, when Spawn goes to rescue her, because there is a repetitious fight out between the clown in this scenario, we have also the clown being Wanda and eventually telling Al what a mistake he had made, and that eventually he's like, this skin and this butt is so hairy. And it's like, oh, well, I'm the clown again. The clown was trying desperately to try anything to tempt Al into a trap or to tempt him to come in there guns blazing again, and he did not do that. He had a cooler head that prevailed. So reasonably, we have it to where Al or Spawn has consistently tried to take out the clown, but reasonably every single time the clown comes back or the clown drags Spawn and his trusty psychic Callisto to hell, drags him. And so reasonably, Callisto is mentioning to Spawn that it's like, well, hey, like, ultimately, like, the clown is trying to drag them onto hell, and ultimately, the clown wants them to fight them there. And so it's like, well, we might as well go there anyway. So basically, Spawn and Callisto goes to hell and starts fighting the Violator, because ultimately, yeah, like Spawn ends up trying to chop off the Violator's head. Ultimately, that doesn't work. Nothing works. But eventually, the monster that is working with the clown to ultimately mention that, like, well, I want you to be the leader of my army of spawns that are going to go and rule over the earth. And so it gets to the point to where Spawn is just like, well, that's great and all, but I'm not doing it. So eventually Spawn goes and basically kills every single other spawn that has ever been spawned into this hell-like world, kills every single one of them, and eventually Spawn and Callisto end up being taken back to Earth to ultimately Terry and Wanda are saying, like, hey, well, like, you have a family here. And Spawn is just like, well, that's great and all, but I think I've already made, like, a family myself. And so, reasonably, Terry is talking about the homeless people that he had been with. And so, reasonably, that is how this movie eventually ends, with just, like, a like some interesting visual effects and some interesting movie, but it's all visuals. It's all really just visuals. You have John Leguizamo at some points being a cheerleader, a clown, seemingly a magician of sorts that deflates his own head and then like showcases that his head is an actual balloon. And I thought that that effect was interesting. I thought that you had Martin Sheen, who rationally is a interesting villain on paper, but doesn't really go anywhere. Like, there's not enough there. There's not enough to keep the ball rolling to have not only him be the real true villain, because the clown is a real true villain at the end of this, because basically the clown is the unstoppable, is the equivalent to Spawn, and so that is the repetitious battle going on there. And because Al is not always doing every single thing that the clown is going to say. And eventually we get to where Coglisto is talking to Spawn at the very end of this, mentioning it's like, well, like it's good that you came around because I'm getting too old, I can't do this forever. And so like it's good that you are going to be the newest defender of of the earth against this evil force because it's good that you changed your mind. And Spawn was ultimately saying it's like, well, like what would have happened if I would have went with the clown and done exactly what he said? It's like, well, then I would have Coglisto mentioned, I was like, well, I would have killed you. I would have cut off your head. Funny enough. There was one moment where the clown had took a knife to Spawn, and he ultimately had uh, a point where like you could have almost said that, oh my god, like could Spawn die from his head getting cut off? But I guess when the knife was taken off, it wasn't completely, there wasn't any much of severed. And Coglisto was mentioning to concentrate on healing the wound. And so I guess maybe there is no definitive way to ever really kill Spawn, because if he can figure out how to heal quick enough, there is no killing Spawn, I guess. I would assume, naturally. So, I guess more than likely you might just have to incapacitate Spawn, I think, at some point. Because even in the series, like I didn't see any like time where Spawn could have like been incapacitated at really legitimately any point. So eventually, maybe at some point in the comics, maybe they mention a Spawn weakness besides just like Wanda or some person of his that he knows. Yeah. So, other than that, yeah, I apologize about how things might have been not heavily detailed, or I kind of just skipped around a little bit, or just kind of went into some parts here and there, or kind of compared some stuff or whatever. But going into here, Spawn, visually interesting, but that's all I can really say. There's I was like going into this movie, I now looked at it in a different light, like, man, yeah, like how much story really was there within this movie? There was very little, like to the point of just how many battles could there have really had? How many like interesting flips and tricks and stuff could they have done? And that's the disheartening part of this film. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.